Thank you much, Alex, for that enthusiastic introduction. So given the Friday just before the holidays, I try to keep it relatively data light and talk more about concepts. Feel free to interrupt me. I guess you have to speak up. I tend not to focus on the comments in the chat because I find it too distracting while I talk. So if there's really something important, just please speak up, and I'm happy to interrupt and explain better what I meant. All right, so early during the pandemic, I had what's called a near-death experience. And here it is. It's a blazing point of pure white light of unbearable intensity without the conceivability of looking away. There's no waveform. There was no space. Everything is contained in a point of pure energy. There are no other visuals, no color, no motion, no texture, no depth, no sound, no silence, neither pain nor pleasure, no feeling of a body, no self, no ego, no memories, no desires, neither hope nor fear. No sensation of the experience being too brief or too long, of wanting it to end. There's no time. There's only terror and ecstasy, that and the icy bright light. So it's called a near-death experience, but what it has, it still has some conscious content. It has the content of this icy bright light, and there's terror and ecstasy. There's no space is annihilated, time is annihilated, body and the environment, all of that's gone. But I was still conscious, although there was no I. It's a so-called non-dual experience, what Buddhists refer to as non-dual experience. And here's sort of a more everyday experience that I do. I live on a small island, Pacific Northwest. You know, this is a typical experience. So my calf muscles burn with fatigue. I will my body to continue to run along the forest trail, looking ahead to avoid roots and rocks. I hear the caw screech of count in the canopy, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just an everyday experience. You run through you run through life and you feel your body and you have thoughts, and this came memory, or I was stopped by this striking image. You remember something, you hear. This is sort of a proverbial stream of consciousness that William James talked about. So both are conscious experiences. What's common to both is this ineffable nature, this subjective phenomenal content. And so that's what, for me, conscious experience is, and that's what I seek to explain. It's notoriously difficult to define it, particularly if it's unclear whether a creature that wouldn't be conscious, whether it can be described. But sort of the American philosopher Thomas Nagel tries it in this way. It feels like something. So it feels like something to have a near-death experience. It feels like something to see or hear or smell or be in love or be angry. And that's what consciousness is. Now, what consciousness is not, what it often gets confounded with, what relates to consciousness, but it's not consciousness, is behavior. So some people say, well, you can only talk about behavior. Well, that may be, but that may be an objective correlate of consciousness. But ultimately, what I seek to explain are what consciousness is, which is phenomenal subjective feeling. So it's not behavior. It's not intelligence, although it relates to intelligence. It's not planning, reasoning, cognition, top-down attention, working memory, or computation. Those are all things that may or may not relate. Some relate more strongly, some relate more weakly to consciousness. Those can all be dissociated. I mean the feeling, the phenomenal feeling of seeing and feeling and loving and hating. And we tend to disregard those in science, but of course they're central to our life, because without them, I wouldn't even know that exist. That this is the Cartesian insight, cogito ergo sum, right? The only way I know and that I exist or anything exists is because I feel, I hear, I love, I hate. And this comes prior to physics. So before I know about atoms and stars and viruses and black holes and whatnot, I have to look at screens. I have to look at voltmeters. I have to look at accelerometer. So ultimately, it all comes back to the central fact of my existence, that I'm conscious, and from that I infer the existence of the world, including its natural laws. So we know a lot about consciousness. It's associated with some complex adaptive biological networks, not all. So we, not the heart. We know we can get a heart transplant. We're still the same person. Not the immune system. We've learned a lot about the immune system in the last 2 years. Very complex, has memory in the form of antibodies, etc. But that doesn't seem to be conscious in a sense. your immune system may be active right now by Omicron, but you may not know about it. Nor the enteric nervous system down in your gut. When you're conscious of your gut because you have a full bloated stomach, it's something in your insula that's active. We know consciousness doesn't require behavior. We experience that every night in sleep when we go into special conscious state called dreams, or during catatonia when people are unable to move, but they're conscious. We know same thing from the clinic and from daily life, that consciousness does not require emotions. Yes, of course, I can love and hate and fear and dread, but also I can just be level, perfectly level and just see without having any particular strong emotions. We know through the psychophysical literature here, Randall Blake has contributed a lot to that, of course, that you can attend to things without being conscious of that. So it sounds a little bit paradoxical, but it's true. You can dissociate top-down attention from consciousness. And I think that's well accepted now. Whether consciousness requires attention, so the other dissociation, I think it's true. I think you can have two-way dissociation. So you can have consciousness without attention and attention without consciousness, but that remains a more controversial question in the field. We know consciousness doesn't require language. I mean, we used to think, of course, we used to think humans are exceptional and only humans have it. But of course, we've certainly as biologists, we've long ago abandoned that belief, and we find precursors of all these things in other creatures. So consciousness doesn't require language nor self-consciousness. A little baby can already be conscious without having a lot of self-consciousness. And of course, our dogs and cats, or other animals we live with, and the mice we work, or the non-human primates some of us work with, they also see and hear the world. They may not be able to reflect about it as we do, but many people don't reflect about the world. Neither do little children nor people with dementia or other diseases, yet we still believe that they're conscious. We know from clinic, HM and other patient, consciousness doesn't require long-term memory. We know from split brain patient that consciousness can occur in one cerebral hemisphere. And we know from 180 years of functional neurology, Oliver Sacks, et cetera, that destruction of specific localized cortical regions can interfere with specific content of consciousness. So if you have a lesion in a particular part of the brain, you might be unable to see color or motion, or you might not have a feeling of familiarity. So you lose a particular category of conscious content without losing consciousness altogether. So many, many years ago, Francis Crick and I, in the last century, in the last millennium, in fact, sort of introduced this term. It's really quite straightforward. We're looking for the minimal neuronal mechanisms jointly sufficient. Not the whole brain, because we know the whole brain is sufficient to generate consciousness, but what are really the bits and pieces of the brain that are jointly sufficient for any one conscious experience? This we call the neural correlate of consciousness, or the NCC. And I hear there's now a Natural Consciousness Club with those abbreviations. So for every conscious percept, there's going to be an NCC, right? And you can study what's common and what's different. So here, I see this, I see a dog, and there will be some mechanisms in the brain. It could be, a bunch of neurons firing in synchrony, or at 40 hertz, or layer 5, or some special promoter, or it could even be a quantum mechanical correlate of consciousness, right? That doesn't, this is sort of agnostic with respect to that will be active in response to seeing the German Shepherd. And it's a causal concept, in the sense that if you take this NCC and you induce it artificially, let's say by a surgeon's electrode, or by TMS, or by optogenetics, or like in the Matrix movie, however, you will have the experience. Conversely, if you interfere with this NCC, again, by a variety of techniques that experimentalists or neurosurgeons do, you can eliminate this percept. And now you can ask, well, where's the difference between seeing a dog or hearing a dog? Are there particular dog neurons that are activated only when you're conscious of a dog? What about a cat? What about seeing color versus seeing motion? Are they all in the same part of the brain, in the same layer? Do they express are they of the same cell type? And then you can ask, hearing and feeling and touching, what's common among those? So, any conscious experience, feeling, dreading, loving, all of those, they have these associated feelings. And you can ask, what is the sort of the neural footprints for those particular feelings that will induce them? Of course, this program doesn't tell you anything about machines. It doesn't tell you about creatures that are very different from us, like C. elegans or squid. But this is a perfectly reasonable research program that sort of people have been doing for the last 35 years in humans and in closely related mammalian species like monkeys, and we do it in my lab here at the Allen in mice. So a typical way to do it, I flash up an image, the standard technique, 40 years old. So and then if you're lying in a magnet, I can arrange the data. So half the time I can arrange the contrast and presentation time. So half the time you see something, the face, and half the time you don't see anything. So the stimulus is always the same, but there's variability in your behavior, in your minute pattern of eye movements, in your attentional focus, or just random variability, neuronal noise possibly, that sometimes you see the stimulus as a face and sometimes you don't. And so now you can collect all the instances when you saw it as a face, you get some activity, and you contrast that when you hear in a magnet, when you don't see the face. So you still do something, right? It's not seeing versus not seeing. It's seeing a face versus seeing sort of this diffuse chiaroscuro pattern fog. And then you can do the contrast. And here you see sort of in this cartoon, well, there's sort of extrastriate cortex lights up and fusiform face area in some prefrontal structures. And you can do the same using CFORS, or you can do EG or single neuron electrodes or neural pixel or whatever your technique is. And you can do this in people, in patients, in babies, in dogs, and cats, in monkeys, in mice. You can do this in any subject, right? You try to keep the input constant. Sometimes the subject sees it or hears it or experiences it. Sometimes it doesn't, and you look at the difference. Now, of course, there are all sorts of confounds you have to worry about. You push a button. You push two different buttons. You have to make sure it's not just a button push. You're in a task. Right here, you're being asked to do something. It seems trivial, just push one button when you see a face and another button when you don't, but we know it does involve structures, particularly in the front of the brain. You have to control for that. And so this is what keeps, PhD students busy and gets you papers and grants and promotion, all of that. And so there's sort of so-called no report paradigm, where you use other techniques, other tricks. Alex has done this. Where you use other techniques to get at what the sort of this NCC is here. So people don't have to do push a button here. You just look at spontaneous. When you just see this stimulus, even without having to push a button, sometimes you see it as a face and sometimes you don't, whether or not you push a button. And you can do the contrast, and in this case, you get much less or no prefrontal activity, suggesting that the prefrontal activity is, up here. The absence of it compared to the previous case is not due to the experience per se, but planning or the mindset that you are in this experiment. You got to remember push that button in the next, and there are lots of other things you can control for it. So this is sort of an ongoing program. So here we're doing it. It's just a paper. We're doing it with masking in mice. So we have this beautiful paradigm now in mice where you have a stimulus either on the left or on the right. We mask it, and you get this typical, this is the interval between the onset of the target and the onset of the mask. If the interval is too short, mask, the animal is basically a chance 50%. And if you wait, a little bit longer, 50 milliseconds or so, then animals are almost back to normal. We're only target. Now what we do, what you can't do in a human very well, we use optogenetics to inactivate primary visual cortex, and that essentially unmasks the mask. It's a really cool experiment manipulating specific cell types, in this case in primary visual cortex, removes the effect of this mask. So that's what I mean by unmask the mask. Anyhow, you can do those experiments in animals. You can also look at the previous, it's called the content-specific NCC. It's the NCC for seeing a grating or for seeing a face versus seeing, noise. You can also do the full NCC, which is where you put people, let's say you contrast, waking state, but eye closed versus, for example, non-REM sleep people have done, or you anesthetize people. Right. So you can do the same thing here. You're looking at truly at conscious, being awake versus unconscious, either natural unconscious like deep sleep or anesthesia-induced unconscious, which of course is not quite the same. And you can even here, you can try to do within state, when people are by EEG criteria are in a deep sleep, but sometimes they still have dreams and sometimes they don't when you wake them up and you ask them retrospectively and you look at the EEG. All right, so you can do all of that, and people have done. And I'll come back to it. Now, you have to distinguish this from what Francis Crick and I call background condition. This distinction is not easy to make, particularly in the clinic, in the emergency room, when you have a patient who's unconscious or who's just moaning, who's clearly alive, but who's not conscious, and you try to interact with them. So we know that these regions in the brainstem, midbrain pons, and medulla, right, is like 4 inches by roughly 1 inch, connecting the spinal cord to the forebrain. These structures, they used to be called the ascending reticular activating system. Today we know it's really a collection of 40 different cell type specific nuclei that are organized in these three-dimensional structures that include, think of it like Grand Central Station, all the power supply, the modulator that you need to activate your brain, thermoregulation, breathing, etc. So we know that small lesions here, particularly if they're bilateral, can be fatal, or they turn you into a coma. So we know from 150 years of emergency room neurology and neurointensivists, or just from chronic patients, that you can have small lesion in these regions and you can be what's called a vegetative state with fully intact cortex. And conversely, you can have, if these structures are not, if these structures are fine, even large destruction of cortex, if it's not complete, you can still have a conscious patient. So these structures are really essential. So we call them background or enabling factors. Just like your heart has to beat, right? We know if your heart doesn't beat within 10 seconds, you faint because there's no power supply in the brain. And if you don't get the oxygen, you lose consciousness, right? But no one says the heart is part of the NCC. It's an enabling factor. Many things your heart has to pump, oxygen has to be present, and a lot of these arousing systems have to be present, noradrenaline, acetylcholine, oxytocin, etc., have to be present, but they don't mediate, but these by themselves are not sufficient. They don't mediate the specific feeling of fearing or dreading or seeing or hearing. That's really part of upstairs, as it were, of the cortical thalamic system, and I think particular of the cortical system and associated satellite structures. So it's important to keep this conceptually, at least, the distinction in mind between enabling background conditions that are necessary and the actual physical substrate that gives rise to any one conscious experience. So now you can go through all the different parts of the brain, which are and which ones are not NCC. So we know you can lose your spinal cord, right? 18 inches long, 3/4 of an inch thick pipe, at this tube. If you lose that, like Christof Rees, you can be in bad shape. You may be on a ventilator if it's high enough, yet you're fully conscious. In fact, it's remarkable. There is very little loss of consciousness, except, of course, sensory and motor, depending on where the destruction of the spinal cord is. So this does not seem to impair consciousness. And you can ask, well, what is it? They're still neurons. They have action potentials. They have synapses. There's plasticity going on. Why not the spinal cord? More interesting is the 80% plus of neurons that make up your cerebellum, right? Particularly the little granule cell. And you have not only the most numerous neurons anywhere in your brain, granule cells, but also the most beautiful neurons, Purkinje cells. Right? They have these beautiful calcium spikes, lots of dynamics, complex learning going on. There's input maps, there's output maps. Yet, when people have lesions, and I've talked to patients with lesions, they never complain about loss of consciousness. They don't complain about loss of experience or seeing or self-experience or emotion or seeing or hearing or smelling. Yeah, they have some. Of course, they have ataxia, slurred speech, unsteady gait, etc. They have what's called cerebellar cognitive affective disorders, but they don't complain about loss of consciousness. In fact, there are occasionally patients like this. This is a woman from China, 24-year-old woman from China who, for various incidental reasons, had to do imaging, and then people discovered she had was a rare case of cerebellar agenesis. So she was born without a corpus, without a cerebellum. right? So she's clearly not a neurotypical, although she can speak and walk, etc. She's a child, etc. But again, she seems to be perfectly conscious, like you and I. So it's a really interesting question. What is it in this case? A highly developed structure, but it doesn't seem to be involved in consciousness. So when people say, well, everything is connected to everything else and everything is equally important, that's patently not, that's false for cerebellum. There are some parts that are critical, in other parts you can lose them and you have little impairment in consciousness. So it's really cortex we have to look to. You know, this, I think of it like a pizza, 12 to 14 inch big, depending on, you know, all sorts of things. It's like a pizza with topping. It's, you know, 2 to 3 millimeter thick, highly convolved and convoluted and folded up. And two of those sheets, these pizza-like sheets, you know, make up your cortex. Highly complex. We now know from partly our efforts, we published 7 papers in Nature in that special issue a couple of months ago, looking at all the different cell types in cortex, roughly 1,000 different cell types. I would submit this is the most complex piece of active matter in the known universe. And I also submit that that relates to the fact that it exudes not only behavior, but also conscious experience. So this is a cell typing program that we and other people are heavily engaged in, trying to identify the basic different variety of cell types by transcriptional means, developmental, epigenetics, et cetera, morphology, physiology, describe all the different cell types that make up the brain. It's a very, very, very complicated structure. Now, to just summarize all of that, why do we think cortex is critically involved in consciousness? There are sort of 3 types of evidence. There are lesion studies. So this is, here I'm primarily talking about human. These are natural lesions where due to stroke, gunshot, virus infection, knife fights, all sorts of interesting, quote, interesting cases in the literature, where we can infer that a particular structure, a particular cortical structure is necessary or is not necessary for experience in particular type of class of experiences, like seeing or hearing or feeling familiar. Now, of course, like any, the interpretation of this is not always easy because it's, of course, adaptation, short-term and particular long-term reorganization. So you can recover from certain lesions, particularly if they're small and or you have them while you're young, particularly before puberty, from certain things. If you're adult or if they're large enough, you can't really recover anymore. So all of these studies, you always have to be careful interpreting them. So that's one source of. The other source of studies, more acute studies, is simulation, right? It's still true today that routinely neurosurgeons will stimulate electrically either subdural or in the tissue, depending on the case, to do functional probing, to do functional mapping of, you know, where do you want to cut? You know, if you have a seizure or you have a tumor to remove, there's always this sort of double-edged sword. You want to take also as much as you can to remove the source of the seizure or the tumor. But of course, the more tissue removed, the more functional loss there is. So you try to minimize that. And there are certain regions that surgeons avoid, so-called eloquent cortex, which typically tends to be, you know, motor cortex, Broca's area, primary visual auditory cortex. And there are other areas that where the surgeons can remove large front parts, non-eloquent cortex, particularly in the front, that don't seem to have any apparent effect on the patient, stress any apparent effect. Certainly not any effect on direct conscious experience of those patients. And then more numerous in the published literature are recording and neuroimaging studies. Those are weaker because they're correlation, right? You put a person in a magnet or an EG or a single unit in human or in an animal, but of course that's correlation. It's useful, but we have to remember that that's correlation. All right, so from all of that, sort of roughly what do we learn? Well, some of the best studies about the NCC, so in this case, involve both correlation as well as causation. This is a study from the lab of Parvizi at Stanford, a neurologist, epileptologist. So here you're looking at brain from below. So the bottom is the back, the occipital cortex, front is on the top. And here you're seeing the right hemisphere. So this is seen, you know, from the feet up. as it were, the right hemisphere. This is a fusiform. This is from below, right? Fusiform, the right and the left. Here, what you show by ECOG array, by conventional mapping, you get the fusiform face area on the right and on the left. Now, if you so that's just if you, every time the patient, you show them a face and you look at where you get specific responses on your ECOG arrays, you get them here and here as expected from fMRI. But then if you stimulate, because these electrodes you can also stimulate, you get only on the stimulation of the right do patients actually experience changes in facial perception. So you can go online and download the paper, and there's video of the patient looking at the doctor while Dr. Pavisi stimulates, and the patient says, reliable, oop, what just happened to your face? You get some sort of Dali-esque face distortion. So that's pretty nice evidence. This is a summary of his work in 120 patients, where he looks at using a battery of tests and standardized protocols to ascertain a really interesting question. If you stimulate an arbitrary part of the brain, when do you get any sort of effect? Either an experience that people says, oh, I hear something, or I smell something, or I get this vague bodily feeling that people sometimes get if you stimulate medial structures, or they get a motor output. It interferes with, if you stimulate Broca's area or you stimulate motor cortex. And typically in the back, sort of half the time, you don't get anything. There's just nothing at the current levels that are permissible, typically, below 10 milliamp. But there's this clear gradient. In the back, you get the most, and in the front, you get very little. In some structures, you hardly get anything at all. So particularly these structures here, you hardly get any, it's just mute. You stimulate part there, and the patient doesn't experience anything, and there are no direct motor effects. Right, so in a review that I wrote with Giulio Tononi, we conclude that for conscious experience, the footprint of conscious experience is really what we call the posterior hot zone. It's a set of areas that exclude primary visual, auditory, somatosensory areas, motor areas, of course, also, but that sort of include a broad swath of posterior cortex, not the front of the brain. The front of the brain is involved in all sorts of things like planning and reasoning and attentional shifts and task sets, etc., but not per se in experience. At least that's the hypothesis. Now, you can ask, where's the difference between the front and the back? One very striking difference is that these structures are all topographically organized, right? They're grids and grids of grids, multi-grid arrangements, because you have topography in vision or in audition or in somatosensory. Well, these sort of are more random. Think of them as, by and large, as random access. And I think that's critical. Yeah, you can also get temporal signature of consciousness. Right, yeah, very briefly, animals. Who else has it? So here you see two female mammals, Homo sapiens and Canis domesticus. We believe both are conscious. One is because I can talk to my daughter, but I can also interact with my daughter's guard dog. She barks and plays, and she obviously doesn't talk, but as Charles Darwin, writes explicitly about, he was a dog lover to boot, they have all sorts of ways to signal. And so the problem, but not just with animal, but the problem, this is a problem of consciousness with anyone else. Ultimately, in the final analysis, I do not know that anyone else is conscious. I have no logical certainty, right? So most of you, or all of you, I don't know whether you're conscious. I assume so, but that's an abduction, right? It's an inference to the best facts, right? Given that we're all closely related, given our structures are all very similar, and given you tell me, oh, there's a beautiful sunset, I assume that you also have an experience similar to the one I have when I'm looking at a beautiful sunset. But it's always an inference. We should never forget that. And that's true for babies. That's true for people who can't talk anymore because they are aphasic, or with people who are demented, or with animals who can't tell us directly, but can tell us all the way, the position of the tail and the ears, whether they're tending or not, and all of that they're happy or sad, that they're fearful, or that they're excited. So similarity, behavior similarity of brain structure, close evolutionary kinship. The thing that really makes us different is we have true language with a highly developed sense of self and an overly developed sense of our own importance vis-a-vis the universe. Lots of things So, here I could spend here. So I did this at an all staff at my institute. I showed, 300 people who do nothing but human and mouse. Those are the two species we specialize in. And I show images like this. Which one is mouse? Which one is human? People are at chance. That's not to say you can't train a machine classified to do it. But basically, once you remove the scale bar, pyramidal cells is very, very similar. We all, in us, it's 2.5 times bigger because cortex in mouse is 2.5 times thinner than in the humans. But the basic stuff, we're all nature children. The basic stuff is very similar. We published many papers showing, at the cell type, you can sort of align the taxonomy of mouse cell types to the taxonomy of human cell types. And so the question is, I'm not going to address here, it's an exceedingly interesting one. How far does consciousness go? Because if you just look at complex behavior, bees certainly have it. Okay, so this is a radiation radically different. We diverged 600 million years ago. They have 1 million neurons inside a package less than a cubic millimeter, 10 times higher circuit density than we have. They can learn things much, much faster than monkeys. And there's just a paper I reviewed recently in Science that shows this very nice quantitatively. Bees can do, let's say, match to sample in 10 trials or 15 trials just with sugar reward, all right? And they do it faster than birds, and they can both do it faster than mammals, although dogs can do one-shot learning, as I know. Anyhow, these bees can do very complicated things. They can do match to sample, non-delay match to sample. They have a waggle dance. They can recognize individuals. They can return to a food source that's 2 miles away, right? Once they sampled from it 2 days earlier. So how do we know it doesn't feel like something? And then, why stop there? Why not, these guys, cephalopods, or why? In fact, then you think, well, do you in fact need a brain, or what is it? It's a very interesting question, particularly if you assume, as Darwin did, natura non facit saltus, that means there's continuity across all of nature, and we can find precursors in everything. So this is sort of an argument that many people have made for that consciousness is probably much more widespread than we like to believe. All right, so now I'm going to come to a theory of consciousness, because ultimately, this is all cool, this research program. It'll run to its end. So in 20, 50, 100 years, whenever, we will know what the NCC are. We will know that activating these neurons of this cell type in that part of the brain in that manner will give rise to an experience of seeing, hearing, feeling, whatever, just like, in Neo in the Matrix, right? Now that's great, because they'll be incredibly useful. There'll be Nobel Prizes. It'll be clinical useful diagnostic for all disorders of consciousness and all sorts of other things. But it doesn't answer a lot of questions like, well, if it's these neurons, why not those neurons? What is it about these neurons, that makes them special, while those neurons over there that seem to look the same and they have the same similar channels and similar action potential, those don't cause consciousness, right? That's the trouble with any specific hypothesis. Why this one and not that? If you believe quantum mechanics, fine, but why is it microtubuli? Why is it not some other physical mechanism? You also need to describe the particular type of experience you're having. Why does space look extended, which is very different from the experience time that flows, which is very different from the smell of a Roquefort cheese, which is very different from toothache. Right? These all have, they not only feel like something, but they feel like something very specific. You want to answer how low does consciousness go? When does it start? Terribly important. I just filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court around the question of, that's very much on the minds of many people, of abortion, and is there any evidence whatsoever for consciousness at 9 weeks post-conception? Conversely, I'm also on a panel that is looking at end of life, because it's somewhat controversial. Which structures are needed for life, and how do you distinguish those structures that are needed for, according to the Uniform Determination of Death Act, from life, from those structures that are needed from consciousness? So there are all sorts of issues here that really require more fundamental understanding. Ultimately, as scientists, you want a fundamental theory of consciousness that tells you in an empirical test way which bits and pieces of the furniture of the universe. My brain is a piece of furniture of the universe, just like any other piece, just like a rock, or a transistor, or my cell phone. They're all part of physics. They're all subject to the laws of quantum mechanics, right? No one gets an exception here. Yet some, brains in particular, seem to produce this additional thing, right? Additional to having objective third person's property that you can poke and measure, they also seem to have this interior view, right? That makes consciousness special. And we need to answer the question, well, which systems have this? And why do they have it? And in what shape do they need to be in? What's the architecture? What's the structure of these systems that they have a conscious experience? In particular, what particular type of structure reflects what particular type of experience, like seeing extended space, flowing time, painfulness of a toothache, etc. And there's one theory that tries to do this in a very fundamental way. I'm not going to explain it. There's no way I can do it. We do workshops on this. It's Julia Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness, IIT. And there are lots of papers. There's an entire website you can go. You can download Python code. There are workshops about it. It essentially, it's a fundamental axiomatic theory. I'll just briefly introduce it. It starts from principles. So it doesn't do what Francis Crick and I did. So many years ago, we said, well, 40 Hertz oscillation is one of the signatures of consciousness. Well, even if that's true, okay, that's fine. That's like a biomarker, right? So now we have a biomarker of consciousness, but that doesn't tell us, as I said, why 40 Hertz? Why not 50 Hertz? Why not 30 Hertz, right? Why does it have to oscillate at all? Well, we don't know. So here, this theory is very different. It starts from fundamental. It has 5 axioms that says so they're sort of like transcendental properties, like Immanuel Kant, transcendental properties that any conscious experience whatsoever has to have. So every experience exists for itself. So when I see or hear or feel or dread, it is for me. It is for myself. It's intrinsically. It doesn't depend on any observer. So that's also the information theory. It's not Shannon information, because there's no information that's sent from A to B here in the Shannon sense, through noisy channel, because there is no sender and a receiver. The brain has to experience for itself. Okay, so A, experience exists for itself. B, any experience is structured. There's many aspects. Even in a dark room, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's close, there's far away, there's distance, right? There's a metric on the space. Whether you think about olfaction or pain, pain, there are different pain, there's different intensity of pain, there's tooth pain, there's headache, there's bowel pain, these are all, so every experience has structure, is composed. Every experience is very specific. It's differentiated. Seeing something, if you think about all possible things you've ever seen, every frame of every movie that you've ever experienced, each one is a distinct experience. And then, of course, there's hearing and smelling and sexual experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So the huge universe of experience, each one is specific. Each one is integrated, it's unified. Each experience is one. It cannot be reduced to independent component. Yes, I can focus attention on particular things in my visual field, but once I experience whatever I'm currently attending to, that is one experience. It's not sewn together into 2 experiences. It's just one experience. And lastly, it's definite. This again seems trivial, but it's terribly important. It's definite in the sense at any one experience, even one as vague as, I have a bad feeling, something bad. I have a feeling something bad is going to happen. Okay, people have these feelings. That's a vague feeling, but it has very specific content. It has as content something bad is going to happen, and it doesn't include seeing or hearing something specific. Right? It has borders, as it were. For any one experience, there are certain things that are inside that constitute the content of that experience, including the near-death experience I talked about, which is very simple. It's only bright light, terror, and ecstasy, but it excludes many other things. And so there are 5 things. Each experience has to exist for itself, has to be structured, has to be differentiated, has to be unified, and is one and only one. So you can take those 5 axioms, translate them into 5 postulates that any mechanisms has to have. And here the theory again takes a fundamental point, a fundamental starting point, because it says for something to exist, it has to have, this goes back to Plato all the way, a dialogue where the Eleatic stranger remarks to Socrates that for something to exist, it must have causal effect on something else. If something has no causal effect, it doesn't exist, strictly speaking. So I don't believe in Santa Claus, because Santa Claus has an effect, of course, so that people believe in him. but that's not Santa Claus. That's the belief people have in Santa Claus. For instance, the ether. Ether used to be a popular thing in physics in the 19th century to explain how light wave can propagate through an empty vacuum. But then ultimately it was discarded because it had such unusual property, didn't really explain anything anymore. It had no causal property. So then let's just get rid of it. So ultimately, this theory argues that anything that exists only qua its causal property. There are extrinsic causal properties and there are causal properties that a system has on itself. The causal property I have on others, I can exert, for instance, through force of gravity or through, electric charge. Those are sort of, the weak and the strong forces. So those are physical properties that ultimately give rise to, the fact that I can reach out and pick up my can or speak to you. But then the theory says, in power that the system has upon itself, that's ultimately what consciousness is. And it has to obey these 5 properties. Intrinsic causal power exists for itself, has different aspects, can be decomposed into different aspects. It's very specific. It's integrated. You're looking for the maximum you're looking for maxima, and then it's definite that you're looking for the largest intrinsic causal effect power of a particular system. So you take a system like a brain, you perturb it in myriads of ways, and you can compute what is the maximum subset of neural mechanism that has this intrinsic causal power. And that's quantified using a number you may have heard called phi. It's a scalar number between zero. It's a non-zero number between 0 and principal infinity. It's not measured in bit because this theory, although it's called information, it doesn't refer to Shannon information. It refers to a much older Aristotelian notion of information, which is really having to do informare, to give form to. It really relates back to Aristotle and his teaching on different forms. Ultimately, you can compute this. So as I said, there's a Python version of this program called PyPython that takes a simple system and says ultimately the minimal irreducible subset that is the physical substrate of consciousness is a particular set of neural mechanisms. And what you experience ultimately, you unfold this intrinsic causal structure, the power the system has on itself, the power the system has to influence its future and to be influenced by the past. This is what causal power means. If I have no causal power on myself, that means that the future is not determined by me. It's just determined by a random distribution, whatever my noise distribution is. The more power I have, the more I can determine future states, and the more I'm determined by future states in my past. And so ultimately, the theory says you have some mechanism like a brain that's in a particular state. It gives rise to a particular substrate, the substrate of consciousness. In this case, it's these particular neurons, not this neuron, not neuron E and D in this toy example. It gives rise to an unfolded causal structure. That is what consciousness is. It's sort of abstract, but it's also very concrete. It says ultimately, it's a very strong theory. It doesn't say it correlates with. The theory says that my experience of extendedness of space is identical to the unfolded causal structure due if I take a set of neurons that, let's say a one-dimensional or two-dimensional set of neurons that are active in a particular state, that is, if I unfold it, that it is what my conscious experience gives rise to. And you can measure it using this number phi. Phi is 0, and then the system, strictly speaking, doesn't exist for itself. It can be reduced to its element. Phi is 0, it does not exist as a system. It can be reduced to a partition of its system. It does not exist by itself. If you exist by itself, you have a phi different from 0. The more you exist for yourself, the bigger the phi, and the more you're conscious. Now, how can you compute this? So there are now ways there's a ongoing clinical study based on these papers. So you can try to measure this experimentally. So you take a brain and you perturb it. Okay, you do that using a transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's like you hit a bell with a hammer and you're listening to the reverberation. The analogy here is you ping it with a transcranial magnetic field pulse with the skull, you activate probably superficial layer 2-3 neurons, and then you can measure the reverberation using EEG. And you can compress, So you have now, let's say, 64, 128 EEG channels. You can plot them as a function of time. Here I showed, this is done in myself. So here I take a subset of these and you ping it, here comes the TMS pulse. You do this, let's say 200 times to get rid of the noise. And you can see the underlying EEG distribution across the 64 channels. And you can then do inverse correlation with Loretta or something to do the current sources that are these here. And in principle, you can compress this. You can use something like Lempel-Ziff compression. That's essentially what's being used here. And you get a number called PCI, Perturbational Complexity Index. The numbers between 0 and 1. 0 means essentially it's a flat line. It's an EEG, no complexity, right? It's just a constant, like in death, in a dead person, completely, or in a very deep coma, completely isoelectric. If it's 1, it means every source is totally independent from everyone else. That doesn't happen in real brains. So in real brains, typically this number tends to be above 0.31. For a reason we don't understand, seems to be in every of the probably 300 patients that have been, or more now, 350 patients where it has been measured. If you are awake and you're conscious, this PCI, so here it's in deep sleep where it's much, much simpler. Here you do it in a clinical context. So here you do it in healthy subjects in various variety of states. So here you plot this PCI, this perturbational complex index. 0, as I said, is totally flat line. 1.0, as I said, never happens. Every source is independent from every other. The brain is interconnected. So typically you get this distribution, but you can have a single threshold for all these patients. So this is in volunteers that are in deep sleep, non-REM sleep, or that are sedated volunteers, anesthesiologists, either in midazolam, which is benzodiazepine, or xenon or propofol. It's below 0.31. If they're in REM sleep, or of course you can have dreams, you're above 0.31. In ketamine, that's a dissociative. It's not true an anesthetic. It's a dissociative. And of course, people abuse it. Vitamin K, it's above 0.31. This is just in wakefulness, eyes closed. It's above 0.31. These are now various control locked-in state where people are conscious, unable to move, but they're conscious. It's about 0.31. Here, there are various control patients with subcortical stroke or cortical stroke, but they're conscious and here can typically speak about it. This is emerging minimal conscious state. So these are patients that used to be in a vegetative state, but now have emerged, are beginning to emerge. So here, 100% sensitivity, 100% selectivity. More challenging is, this is the revised coma scale, where you judge patient in emergency room or in the clinic based on responsiveness to spoken command, eye movements. So typically these patients are minimal. They're called MCS plus, MCS minus. So here you have lower coma scale, towards 8 or 7, where people can barely move or may not be able to talk, but can occasionally move their eyes or finger or something. And these are people who are typically behavioral unresponsive. So these are also called vegetative state patients. And so here, these patients are a grave challenge to the clinical arts, because these patients, behaviorally, you can't interact with them. They're alive, although typically on a ventilator. Occasionally, Terry Schiavo, you might remember, occasionally the patient may moan or move about, but in not coordinated way, not response to command. So here you don't know. And what this index says that in some of these patients, clearly the complexity of the brain, the complexity of a brain measured using PCI is similar to that of a waking brain. So the inference here in these patients is that they're actually conscious, but are unable to speak because they have severe brain damage. While these patients are truly not conscious. And it also has some this PCI scale. This is how it looks, by the way. Here you stimulate, you typically get these amplitudes, 10, 20 microvolts. And then this is in a patient that's conscious, 0.44. This is in a patient that's not conscious. This is in a very severe coma case. This patient is very unlikely to recover. That's a claim. Depending on the response to the TMS EEG, you can also prognosticate. So this is now being tested in a clinic, and we'll see, because right now we have no tools for these DOC, the disorder of consciousness patients. All right, let's skip that. We're also doing that in mice. Let's skip that. Let's skip that. Okay, yeah, because so the theory makes some cool. Of course, we know about split brain experiments, right? So when your brain is one single integrated brain by 200 million fibers of the corpus callosum, the theory says, well, you'll have this. The maximum of phi will extend, the back of the brain, of cortex across both left and right hemisphere. And as far as we can tell in radical split brain, when you cut the entire corpus callosum, including the posterior and the anterior commissure, you have two speaking hemispheres. Two conscious hemispheres. Only typically the left one can speak about it, and you have to silence it by injecting sodium amytal or doing some other tricks in order to get access to the right hemisphere. But as far as we can tell from these patients, they're both conscious, two consciousness in one skull. Now, the theory says you can also do the opposite. IIT says you can do what I call brain bridging, where I connect one brain with another brain. So I take my brain and connect it with Alex's brain. Let's say early on, I connect my V1 to his V1 and my MT to his MT, etc. And the theory says, well, as long as the integrated information, the phi within this brain and within this brain is smaller than the integrated information across both brains, there will be one conscious footprint here and one conscious footprint here. And this person, I will have my own experience and Alex will have my own experience, although I might be able to access what Alex is seeing. But once you add, like an artificial corpus callosum, that's why I call this brain bridging, in principle, at some point, and this may only involve it's like a phase transition, a single additional axon, at that point at which the integrated information across both brains exceeds that of within this brain or within this brain, this individual will disappear, this individual will disappear, and there'll be this new amalgamation of this new entity that now speaks with two tongues and, has 4 legs and 4 arms. And there are some cases of twin, like there's Tatiana twins here north of us in BC, where one can investigate. They have a so-called brain bridge. They have a thalamic brain bridge due to developmental defect. So the question is, can this also occur naturally, or will this require future technology? All right, so let me finish here. Much more one can say, but I'm mindful of the time. So according to integrated information theory, conscience is a cause-effect structure. It's a physical structure. It's not behavior. It's not intelligent. It's a physical. It's the most real thing there is. It's a causal. It makes a difference to the world. It makes a difference to the system. It's this cause-effect structure that maximizes integrated information. It's about intrinsic causal power. Any system that has intrinsic causal power will feel like something, whether it's evolved or not, whether it's artificial or not. It's not about input-output transformation. The theory is not a cognitive theory. In this case, it's not that it transforms a particular input into a particular output, or it's not about computation. Not at all about computation. This theory also says that in principle, there can't be a Turing test, because in order to determine whether a system is conscious or not, you have to look under the hood, because it can show formally that two systems can be formally identical in terms of input-output mapping. If you look at the input-output mapping, one is a feed-forward structure, the other one is a heavily feedback structure. In principle, they perform exactly the same, but one will have some phi non-zero, the other one will have a phi of 0. So you can have systems that perform the same thing, but if the internal wiring is different, one will be conscious and the other one not. It says experience is widespread in the animal kingdom. There are no group minds. Oh yeah, so I don't have time to talk about it. The existence of state of pure experience that, with no content. So you take, let's say, a near-death experience, but then you remove the terror, the ecstasy, and the light. You can still have an experience. It's a very strange thing. In a strict sense, experience has no function, just like electric charge has no function in physics, right? You don't go to a physics lecture and ask what's the function of physics. Certain systems, like biological systems, have charge, and they make use of that, for example, to separate charges inside and outside the membrane. That's also true of consciousness in the wider sense, but in the narrow sense, phi just is a property of certain complex system. But, just like spandrels, evolutionary pressure leads to systems which have high integrated information. And so the last slide is, it's an important point. Particularly, I talk a lot. I'm here in Seattle, with Amazon and Google and other people in the tech industry, particular, when are we going to reach true AI or not? And here the point is, the IAT says intelligence and consciousness are really very different things. So intelligence is the ability to manipulate, to predict multiple time scale, to predict what's going on, to assess threats, and to learn from an environment where you have many actors acting over a variety of time scale. And we can measure that in humans, with G factors, and we have various tools to measure that. Now, in principle, the theory says consciousness is very, very different. So you have evolutionary structures that evolve where you have this co-evolution with intelligence and consciousness. So in general, we believe a dog is more intelligent than a mouse and a bee, humans top it. And they have intelligence and consciousness, but it's certainly from a principle point of view, can build or engineered structures like a cerebral organoid that, for example, if you build them large enough, we can't do it right now, but people are busy building these carpets, these cortical carpets. Think about you develop in a dish something as large, not just a peanut butter cookie like a monkey, but like a human, a pizza, but it's cortical. It, expresses cortical factors and has action potential and something. It's just a question of time before this will happen. According to IT, this system will feel like something, although if you don't connect it to input-output, it doesn't have any intelligence whatsoever. Conversely, you can imagine things like AlphaGo, AlphaZero, AlphaFold, all the various AIs and GTP2 and 3 and Lambda and all these other chatbots that look to be intelligent or possibly even high intelligence, possibly superhuman performance in some particular domain, yet they don't feel like anything. And so, let's not confuse intelligence with consciousness. And with that, I'll leave you and thank you for your attention.